Welcome to our plastic pollution virtual workshop titled Plastic Pollution in Our National Parks. We'll have a few more folks join us as we get going here, but in the meantime, we'll start doing introductions. We have a couple of really great speakers for tonight from the National Parks Conservation Association, and I'll introduce them in just a few minutes. But first, I'm James Taylor from the UNF Institute of Environmental Research and Education. Many of you know us probably from the emails you got about this event, but we host a lot of different programs ranging from supporting faculty research, but also a leadership program, an honor society, and many other great programs for students from all colleges across campus. With us tonight are Dr. Heather Truelove from psychology and Dr. Aaron Largo White, the director of IRE and a professor in public health. And I will let one of them go ahead and talk a little bit more about the grant that supports these projects from NOAA.
Okay, thanks, James. So I'm Aaron Largo White. I'm a professor in the Department of Public Health, and I'm the director of IRE. That's what we call the Institute of Environmental Research and Education. And I'm one of the co-principal investigators on this research project, along with our UNF partner, where she can't see her on my lineup, but Dr. Heather Truelove from the Department of Psychology, and our team of 4 others. We have 4 other investigators at Eckerd College in coastal biology, environmental science, and computer science. And basically, this project is a 2-year study that's funded by NOAA Marine Debris Program. And essentially, we're working to reduce single-use plastic consumption and foster long-term pro-environmental behaviors among undergraduate students in coastal communities. So ultimately, what we're trying to do with this 2-year grant is to reduce the generation of marine debris in those areas over time. So over the 2-year study, we're kind of right in the middle right now, but over the 2 years, we're integrating plastic reduction challenges, so challenging students to reduce their use of single-use plastic, education strategies, outreach initiatives, all to increase awareness, affect attitudes and beliefs, and ultimately encourage behavior change among members of both campus communities regarding, around their single-use plastic consumption. So this discussion today is part of that education and outreach effort. And yeah, that's it. And we're really looking forward to it. So thank you for being here.
Thank you. And with that, I'll introduce our speakers from the National Parks Conservation Association. Dr. Sarah Barmeyer is the Senior Managing Director for Conservation Programs at the NPCA. She coordinates priority initiatives related to water, wildlife, air, landscape conservation, energy, sustainability, and climate change for the benefit of national parks. She directs NPCA's water program and executes campaigns to protect and restore waterways and habitats in coastal national parks. Dr. Melissa Abdo leads conservation and park protection efforts for the National Parks Conservation Association's Suncoast region, which encompasses Florida, Louisiana, Puerto Rico, and the U.S. Virgin Islands. She has a background in conservation biology and has been recognized for her work leading biodiversity exploration and conservation efforts in many tropical countries. Her work at NPCA focuses on leading both place-based efforts such as conserving the greater Everglades ecosystem and on systematic issues facing our national parks, such as the climate crisis, energy development, and endangered species conservation. With that, I'd like to welcome our speakers and I'll turn it over to them. And if students, you have any questions, feel free to place them in the chat while we go. And at the end, we will open it up for some dialogue if you would like to do a Q&A or ask any questions about this or possibly other things about the NPCA. But in the meantime, put any questions you have in the chat.
Great. So thanks so much, everyone. It's so nice to join you all this evening. So yes, so I'm Sarah Barmeyer. I'm based in Washington, D.C., as it was stated before. So it's really exciting to, be part of this. And I love this initiative. And it's one of my favorite and least favorite topics that we have to discuss. But it's so important to make a big difference. So a little bit about the National Parks Conservation Association. We're a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization dedicated to protecting and preserving our country's most iconic places for future generations. We were founded in 1919 by the very same people who founded our country's national park system. And today we have 1.6 million members and supporters across the country. So it's we're growing, and it's a lot of great people like you out there that really helps us get our mission across. An important part of NPCA's role as stewards of healthy parks is to make America's parks cleaner for future generations, which includes efforts to reduce and eliminate plastic pollution in parks, which is what we're going to talk about here tonight. So I'll turn this over to Melissa to talk more about what's going on in Florida.
Thank you so much, Sarah, and all of our colleagues at UNF. So as Sarah was saying, NPCA, we go about our work at the national level to help advance systemic policy change and park protection, but we also do a great deal of work at the local and community level. So here in the Suncoast region of NPCA, we work in communities all across Florida, and our Suncoast Regional Office is one of 11 regional offices across NPCA nationwide. Much of our work here in the Suncoast focuses on protection and defense of the Greater Everglades ecosystem, where I'm sitting this evening, right? And the Greater Everglades ecosystem is anchored by 4 national parks, and all of them protect both terrestrial and coastal ecosystems. And these parks are pictured on the slide here. They are Big Cypress National Preserve, Everglades National Park, Biscayne National Park, and Dry Tortugas National Park. And our region's national parks are really significant because they protect such great resources, abundant biodiversity. Everglades National Park, in fact, was the first national park that was established primarily to conserve biodiversity. And yet, despite their importance, none of our region's national parks are immune to the effects of plastic pollution. And in fact, significant research has been done in South Florida on the presence of polluting plastics in our environment and in our parks. And we'll get to more on that later. But now I'll pass it back to Sarah.
Sure. So now that you all have the context of what our organization does and how our focus is on parks and connected ecosystems and communities, let's dive into the problem at hand, plastic pollution and how it's plaguing our national parks. So the science is in. America's national parks are suffering from plastic pollution, ranging from large debris to microplastics, derived from synthetic materials. Even in the most remote national parks, plastic pollution is inescapable due to the waste generated by more than 330 million annual visitors who leave behind millions of pounds of waste bound for area landfills. So the National Park Service actually manages 700 million pounds of waste each year, which is equivalent to the weight of 155 Statues of Liberty. This is big numbers of trash for like things you don't really think about when you think of the Park Service. And if you include the waste managed by park concessionaires, like these are the hotels and visitor centers and those sorts of things, that number more than doubles. So single-use plastic is a significant source of the landfill waste. So we'll talk about this a little bit throughout the talk tonight. But so one of the things that we're working on is we're partnering with Subaru on the Zero Landfill Initiative at 3 pilot parks, Denali in Alaska, Grand Teton in Wyoming, and Yosemite in California, to significantly reduce waste at parks. And we'll talk a little bit more about what all we found through this. But just to set this up, we did a survey in 2016 and found that more than 1/3 of park visitors bring single-use water bottles to parks. And less than half of those park visitors actually sort and recycle their waste before leaving. Park Service staff and volunteers spend substantial time cleaning up trail and waterway litter, reducing wildlife and visitor hazards, and hauling waste to landfills, which not only costs parks money, but also detracts from meaningful visitor experience. So NPCA has really learned along the way that raising awareness about this issue through education can lead to positive behavioral changes that can really reduce plastic in parks. So to that point, the survey found that nearly 4 out of 5 park visitors would be in favor of eliminating single-use plastic, single-use water bottles specifically, if they knew it would reduce the waste and clean up parks.
And So given the broad context of what Sarah has just shared around how plastic plagues national parks across the country, it's also helpful to dive into one specific park example to further illustrate the ecological and management challenges that plastic pollution poses. So for this example, let's take Biscayne National Park here in Florida. Biscayne is in fact our country's largest marine national park, and it protects part of the Florida Reef Tract, which is the third largest reef in the world, and the only living barrier reef present in the continental US. But sadly, plastic pollution is prevalent in Biscayne's waters, and a major part of that plastic pollution consists of inappropriately discarded or lost monofilament fishing line. So this is thin fishing line, but it's incredibly strong, and it can be really difficult to see and remove. And it does severe damage to corals and to marine wildlife. And the diver that's pictured here on this slide is basically carefully removing this discarded fishing line from hard bottom habitat in Biscayne just last year. And to get an idea of the effort it takes to remove this plastic line and the extent of the problem, consider that during just 1 week of volunteer marine debris removal, volunteer divers, less than 10 volunteer divers removed around 3 football fields in length of discarded fishing line. So if we take a step back and consider that the Park Service manages about 10% of our country's coastline, you can imagine the significance of all of the marine debris challenges posed along those coasts. And we also cannot, of course, look at the problem of plastic pollution in isolation. We have to look at plastic pollution and how it is intrinsically connected to anthropogenic climate change. And climate change is what we now consider to be the biggest overarching threat that is facing our national parks. We know that more than 99% of plastic is derived from fossil fuel source chemicals. And it is clear that plastic production helps fuel the climate crisis, and it causes air and water pollution where it is produced. Furthermore, the entire life cycle of plastic damages ecosystems and human health. And parks, despite their protected status, are not immune to either the indirect or direct impacts from fossil fuel extraction. So did you know, for example, that about 10% of our country's park units contain subsurface minerals? So in other words, that's oil, gas, and other valuable commodities that are privately owned within those national park units. So one of those national park units is Big Cypress National Preserve right here in South Florida. And it is currently being threatened by a major proposal to drill for new oil within its boundaries, which would destroy valuable wetlands and translate to a new national park unit, a national park unit being a new source of more climate changing carbon. So because of the life cycle of plastics, it's important to remember that it's intrinsically linked with fossil fuels and climate change. And we need to remember that curbing plastic will also help in our efforts to mitigate climate change. And I'd like to share just one more slide here that illustrates important facts about climate change and our national parks. So recent research that was conducted by the National Park Service, University of California, and University of Wisconsin scientists, and this research was published by Gonzalez et al. In 2018, it indicated that national parks are in some ways showing disproportionately more stark climate signals than the US in general. And so that's basically saying that across the more than 400 national park sites in the US, clear evidence shows that these parks are being impacted by climate change, and in many ways to more startling degrees than the general United States. So their particular study found, for example, that over the past century, up until around 2010, mean annual temperatures of the national park area increased at double the rate of the US as a whole, double the rate. Annual precipitation of the national park area declined significantly on 12% of national park areas compared to 3% of the general US. So there's a great deal of evidence as well that ecological changes are happening in parks caused by climate change. And we know, for example, that many plant species are blooming earlier. And on the habitat scale, forests from subalpine forests to coastal mangrove forests are also shifting across landscapes and elevations. So this is all to help get a sense of the dire impacts that climate change is having in our national parks.
So now that we've set the stage, gone over the scale of the problem of plastic pollution in parks and provided context as to the connectivity of fossil fuel extraction and how climate change is also threatening parks, let's take a closer look to try not to depress you even more about how plastics are affecting specific parks, their wildlife, and their ecosystems. Yes, Padre Island. So let's take a look. This is new research, actually. Well, long-term research, but new study that's recently come out at Padre Island National Seashore, where researchers have been aggregating data on green sea turtles specifically in order to learn how green sea turtles are interacting with plastic pollution at Padre and the toll that ingesting plastic pollution is taking on the turtles. So unfortunately, this is not a new problem. Marine debris has been a huge problem for this park since the 1980s, and estimates are that now over 90% of the debris at Padre Island is plastic. So just to also note, Padre Island National Seashore is located on the Gulf of Mexico, on the southern portion of Texas. Just so it's similar Gulf of Mexico waters on the other side from where y'all are located. So since researchers now that know that plastic has been ingested by more than 700 species, marine species specifically worldwide, the researchers at Padre Island wanted to learn more specifically about how plastic pollution was being ingested by the green sea turtles. So they conducted this analysis, compiling data over the long term. Their findings, which we'll get into in a moment, included data from about a 30-year time frame that they've been collecting of more than 450 individual green sea turtles. So what did the researchers find in their studies? They found that most commonly ingested types of plastic, most commonly ingested kinds of plastic waste found in the guts of the green sea turtles were plastic bags and plastic wrap. I mean, clearly this is one of the things that the sea turtles, it looks like their own food. So that's why they go after objects that look like this. Additionally, foam bottles and fishing line were also found in turtles. They found that small turtles, so in other words, juveniles or young turtles, were likeliest to have the most significant amounts of plastic in their guts. And alarmingly, they also found that the number of turtles eating plastic doubled since late 1980s from about 30% then in the late 1980s to 65% in 2019. However, slightly more promising is that it appeared that researchers found that the plastic isn't directly linked to the cause of death by the turtles, but the question still remains of the overall effects of the plastic on the health of turtles and other marine wildlife. So overall, researchers are advocating for reforming plastic use as being an essential step for protecting marine wildlife and their habitats.
We can also look at another case study from recent research done here in South Florida as well. And while this research was conducted outside of park boundaries, not within a park like the case study from Texas, from Padre Island that Kara just shared, we do know that all marine and coastal ecosystems are highly connected. So I thought this was an interesting one to point out. So in this study, researchers took water and sediment samples from around Tampa Bay, and they tracked the presence of microplastics in those samples. And they found that microplastics are abundant and widely dispersed. So yes, more depressing news, unfortunately, but widely dispersed in the surface water as well as the sediments of Tampa Bay. And they also found higher concentrations of microplastics closer to industry and at the river mouth, which kind of makes sense. However, somewhat alarmingly, they found that the microplastics abundance in their sediment values was substantially higher than found in comparable other coastal studies that they looked at. And the majority of the microplastic samples that they recovered appear to have come from different kinds of fiber, like clothing fiber, which means that it's likely that the wastewater was a key source of bringing the microplastic pollution into Tampa Bay. So think wastewater and gray water from laundering clothes and going down our residential and commercial drains. They also found that intense rainfall and runoff were a major influencing factor, with higher microplastics concentrations found after intense rainfall events. And overall, this study articulates the influence that both non-point and point wastewater pollution can have in bringing microplastic pollution into our estuaries and our bays. And last but not at all least, we can't talk about case studies of plastic pollution in national parks and their surrounding ecosystems without noting the growth in visitation at so many of our parks, especially as there is really no reason to believe that increased visitation is going to let up anytime soon. So this past summer, for example, during June and July of 2021, those months set monthly attendance records in many parks, leading to multi-hour waits for popular trails, increased trash, wildlife disruption, and sadly defacement of cultural artifacts in some cases. Arches National Park, seen in these photos, for example, had to turn away visitors on a nearly daily basis. Yet between 2011 and 2019, the Park Service lost nearly 16% of its staff capacity, while at the same time struggling to accommodate a 17% increase in visitation. So the decline in staffing capacity and park funding over the last 10 years really give us a sobering view of the ability of the Park Service to successfully respond to the rapidly evolving visitor use challenges that certainly include waste management and plastic pollution. So we've covered the big picture problem of how plastics are affecting national parks. We talked about the context of how plastic production is in part fueling the climate crisis. And we've taken a deep dive into a couple of case studies highlighting the impacts of plastics in parks and their connected ecosystems. We've also provided you with some statistics on how park visitation and the Park Service's limited ability to effectively deal with waste management are a part of the issue in national parks. So now we would like to move into a discussion around potential advocacy and policy pathways to help address plastic pollution. And let's start by asking the question, what can be done and via what tangible pathways to address plastic pollution in parks at a systemic level? Well, first, as we want to go about answering that question, it's really helpful to describe some of the different framework that exist in terms of how our national parks are managed, how policies are decided upon and implemented in practice. So here on this slide, I'm showing some of the key decision-making bodies and agencies that oversee and direct the management of our national parks, starting with the president and his administration, or the executive branch, where they set guiding policy that is then implemented by executive departments and then by federal agencies that are involved directly in park oversight and management. Additionally, Congress has its own power to write and pass laws, of course, and these laws are actually crucial in park management. In fact, most national park units are created through acts of Congress, which create what is called the enabling legislation of individual parks. Now, the Department of Interior is also considered to be part of the executive branch and generally consists of appointees chosen by the current administration and sometimes confirmed by Congress. The Secretary of the Interior is currently the Honorable Deb Haaland, and she oversees staff, including the Assistant Secretary for Fish, Wildlife, and Parks, who provides oversight over the federal agencies that are charged with managing many of our public lands like national parks and wildlife refuges. And the primary federal agency that manages our parks is the National Park Service, But I'd also like to mention that other federal agencies play really important roles in managing our public lands and waters. And those include the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, NOAA, like the federal agency that is sponsoring this series through the grant that our colleague was talking about earlier, and the U.S. Geological Survey also plays an important role. USFWS, or the Fish and Wildlife Service, for example, they manage national wildlife refuges and implement key environmental law, like the Endangered Species Act. NOAA also manages large areas of marine protected areas, and USGS is heavily involved in providing research assistance to both NPS and NOAA. And last, but not at all least, individual park units are each managed according to their unique natural and cultural resource preservation goals. And those are translated by Park Service policy and individual park superintendents. Now, generally, most major park decisions are governed by NEPA, the National Environmental Policy Act. And that act helps ensure that the public is informed of and has a chance to weigh in to important decision-making that affects parks. So now that you have a general sense of the oversight and management framework, I'd like to pose the question, what policies within the Park Service might be in place to help protect our parks from plastic pollution? Well, you may be surprised to learn that there really isn't a great deal of specific guidance in place directing the Park Service on how to prevent or manage plastic pollution in parks. But I will highlight two of the most relevant policies the Park Service has currently. One is a 2011 policy guidance memo, which states that in part, park superintendents do have the ability to ban plastic water bottles and other plastic in parks. But there is a really lengthy and intense series of studies that must include, among other things, a review of the amount of waste that could be eliminated from the park, the cost of installing and maintaining water filling stations for visitors, the resulting impact, economic impact on concessionaires and cooperative association revenues. So there's a lot of extensive studies that need to go into considering the decision to prevent the use of plastic water bottles and other single-use plastics in parks. So this is, again, all coming from a memo in 2011. And importantly, that memo also cited a lot of the very real-world difficulties that face the reduction or that are basically posing a challenge to reducing plastic use in parks. For example, a ban could certainly affect visitor safety. When we think about the fact that proper hydration is key if you're planning a 2-hour hike or a paddle out in the Everglades or a multi-day backcountry excursion. So these are very real world considerations that the Park Service is challenged to consider. And the second policy guidance piece that the Park Service has is around how the parks should advance their mission through sustainable operations. And this is known as the Green Parks Plan. And this was first developed in 2010 and then updated in later years in 2016. And basically in the Green Parks Plan, this plan originally called for a couple of waste reduction goals that were related to plastic bottles. For example, it stated that NPS, or the National Park Service, would provide drinking water filling stations at visitor facilities and would make them accessible both during and after normal operating hours in 75% of visitor facilities by 2016. Now, that did not happen, but progress was made. One of the other goals of that plan was that NPS would require concession operators to also sell reusable water bottles and eventually halt the sale of disposable water products. That also was supposed to happen in around 75% of appropriate facilities by 2016. However, to date, the reality is that the Park Service has fallen short of these goals and still faces significant real-world challenges to meeting them. But progress has been made in certain parks. So the news is not at all bad. And I will hand it over to Sarah now to share some of that positive progress.
Yes, progress has indeed been made. And even despite some of these policies, like we know of individual parks doing their best, just noting the trend that's happening for having refill stations, that visitors want that and they're responding to that, which I think there's a lot of great progress on this front. So specifically, I do want to jump back to the Subaru partnership that we have with the Zero Landfill Initiative, which is honestly is becoming one of my favorite projects at MPCA. So we found that by working directly with national parks, gateway communities, these are the communities right adjacent to the entryway of parks, park concessionaires and nearby businesses, it's really paramount to working with these entities to reduce plastic pollution and its circulation in parks. So this is just a really great example of a collaborative partnership that is working at an individual level with parks to help meet this gap where the Park Service, itself as a managing agency has some shortcomings due to a variety of issues, but one is like, I mean, they're not waste managers, that's a lot to ask for the Park Service along everything else. So since the launch of this initiative in 2015 at these 3 pilot parks, again, Denali, Grand Teton, and Yosemite, these are all very different parks with issues and challenges, but they've all made significant strides by nearly doubling their recycling and composting capabilities and keeping more than 16 million pounds of waste out of landfills. In 2019, more than 8.5 million visitors to Denali, Grand Teton, and Yosemite contributed to nearly 8 million pounds of waste left behind. Through our Zero Landfill Initiative work, nearly half of that waste was either recycled or composted, meaning is not sent to landfills. And I'll give just an interesting example. So Grand Teton, for example, in Wyoming, they have to truck their waste over 100 miles to a landfill in Idaho. Like these are gas costing savings. I mean, these are like when you just think about all of what they're not doing now because they can do things on site. It's really, like I said, it's one of my favorite projects. So today in these parks, nearly 1,000 new waste, recycling, and composting containers are all strategically placed in high visitation areas right together, very well labeled. And all these places are, they're seeing huge results with this stuff. So we can talk about the great work that's happening at these parks, but really, how is that getting to this issue? We got to stop plastic pollution from entering parks in the first place. That's where we continue to fall down on. So we're making progress, as Melissa was saying. So one of the most exciting things I think is that MPCA has been working with quite a few groups, closely with Oceana, for example, leading this effort. We drafted a great letter to Secretary Holland that was sent last summer with more than 300 groups signing on to this letter, delivered to the National Park Service and the Department of the Interior, that really detailed many problems associated with plastic pollution in our parks. Overall, the letter recommends eliminating the sale in national parks of single-use plastic, beverage bottles, plastic bags, disposable foodware, and more. So nowadays, reusable water bottles that cost less than $1 each can readily be purchased, and there are refill stations now at parks. So this is really something that the parks have been doing to reduce plastic pollution and also saving consumers money. So the letter also points out that obviously, parks can be leaders in this movement towards a regenerative and inclusive future, and emphasized our shared confidence that ending the sale of plastic pollution in parks will benefit park visitors, park budgets, and park ecosystems, as well as contribute to the current administration's larger goals on environmental justice and the climate crisis. So in order to warrant the recommendation to eliminate single-use plastics in national parks, the letter really based on a firm factual information that we felt the administration needs to know. So some of these facts, that we cite in the letter include that nearly 40% of the plastic produced annually is for single-use plastics and packaging, materials that are, made to last forever, but designed to be used very briefly, and you just throw them away. Plastic production is projected to quadruple between 2014 and 2050, greatly compounding the problem since a meager 9% of all plastic waste that's ever been generated has been recycled. It also highlights how plastic pollution from tiny microplastics to plastic bottles to even larger plastic debris are polluting our parks, as we talked about today. Plastic trash is often visible in parks, unfortunately, which really impairs the visitor experience. And it also takes away from, these treasured natural resources and historical sites that people are coming to see. It harms wildlife and ecosystems, and then these horrific entanglement situations that we see with large marine mammals, such as the whales, sea turtles as well, to the impairment of just microscopic organisms in the soil. And it's also, as we've noted, fueling the climate crisis. So this is something that this letter really outlines all of these key points. And we've heard, fingers crossed, that there are efforts right now within the Park Service as well as Interior to take a really hard look at how they can do their part to contribute to ending the sale of plastic in parks. So yeah, good progress is being made though.
Yes, progress is being made, certainly. And I'll just highlight one other advocacy piece here that actually preceded the letter that Sarah was talking about that was more recently sent by over 300 groups. So there was also back in December 2020, a full report on the plastic pollution crisis. It was provided by other environmental groups to our national leadership. And this plan is known as the Presidential Plastics Action Plan. Again, this is a plan that was put together by environmental groups. And it was delivered to the administration's transition team in Congress. And it highlights 8 executive actions that could be taken to address the plastic pollution crisis. And I just wanted to quickly call out 3 of those because they're especially important in the context of conserving our national parks. First, one of the recommendations was to use the purchasing power of the federal government to eliminate single-use plastic items and replace them with reusable products. So a lot of what we've been talking about tonight as a real tangible solution. Second, advance environmental justice in petrochemical corridors. Some of those areas are indeed, as we talked about, gateway community areas to parks. And last but not least, reduce and mitigate the impacts of discarded and lost fishing gear. That's certainly a big one in our coastal and marine parks. And then just reminding everyone of the fact that indeed the Park Service manages 10% of our coastline and significant marine areas. So close to wrapping up now, but I just wanted to point out one final thing on the advocacy and policy side, and that is that in addition to advocating for policy change at the national level, like we've been talking about through influencing federal purchasing that is overseen by the Department of the Interior and also monitored by the Council on Environmental Quality, there are other regional, state, and local mechanisms for reducing plastic pollution that affects our parks and ecosystems. However, unfortunately, in the case of Florida, our state is falling behind the rest of the nation in efforts to reduce marine pollution and safeguard marine habitats from the dangers of single-use plastics. A more positive example would be that in 2014, California was the first state to enact legislation focused on banning single-use plastics, and it was followed by 7 other states. Unfortunately, Florida is not on the list. One of the biggest obstacles in limiting single-use plastics at the Florida state level are preemptive laws that essentially limit the authority of local communities from placing bans or regulatory restrictions on the use of single-use plastics. And this preemptive law in Florida makes it difficult for cities and counties to basically take meaningful action around reducing plastic pollution. Annual efforts to enact statewide legislation or repeal these preemptive laws have been generally unsuccessful. However, the actions of individuals and groups to engage with their state legislators is definitely one way to change this in the future.
Yeah, so now that we're getting to the end of our talk this evening, we're going to end on a constructive note and share some ideas and recommendations around what individuals and people can do to help parks. So, as we just talked about, one thing that MPCA is doing along with others, and we're certainly happy to provide, ways that y'all can help to advocate that the Park Service eliminate the sale and distribution of single-use plastics in national parks is one big step. Then there are the obvious, individual actions that people can do. Bring your own water bottle or coffee mug. I've got like tea and water here that I've been drinking on, like right here. Bring those to parks. You will have refill stations, most likely. Most of them have all of that now. Make, sustainable souvenir and supply choices. Choose reusable bags and materials that can be reused instead of, opting for the plastic bag. Avoiding buying single-use plastic items and then disposing of them in parks, and know what can be recycled, and then location of bins in parks. And I do want to touch on the one thing that Melissa, you were just mentioning, encouraging more aggressive pollution production, measures at gateway cities, which, as we were talking about in Florida just now, one thing that we know about the plastic waste solution in parks, most of it comes from outside park boundaries. It's not being generated in the parks. It's coming from when you stop by Publix on the way into the park and you buy the case of water bottles. And then that's what's now in the parks that the park is left to deal with. So one of the things that we've really found is that national parks do benefit when nearby local governments implement more aggressive pollution measures, such as bag fees or styrofoam fees and plastic straw bans. Things like this. So when gateway communities actually implement these preventative measures and sustainability practices, these actions can really help reduce waste from the beginning, from entering parks to begin with. So, yeah.
Hey, well, thank you so much, Sarah, for highlighting those ways that individuals can take action and be part of the policy and individual and community solutions. And in conclusion, I think we just want to emphasize that folks really can play a big role in bringing about solutions to this problem. And a couple additional ways that we would like to encourage you to stay connected to active policy issues affecting our national parks are listed here on the screen. First, we've got NPCA's advocacy link there, where we're going to bring important issues, plastics and beyond, and much, much more to the forefront so that folks are aware of them. And then I've also listed for you the National Park Service's Park Planning website, where you can look up parks individually, and you can also see open public comment periods. So these are comment periods that fall under the umbrella of the National Environmental Policy Act that I was talking about earlier, and are all really great ways for you to be engaged in policy affecting the parks that you care about. Our contact information is also presented again on this slide here, and Sarah and I would both like to emphasize that national parks are living classrooms where best practices and technologies can truly be leveraged to reduce and eliminate plastic pollution, all the while educating visitors from around the world around how their actions can make a tangible difference. So thank you again for your time this evening. It's been a pleasure, and we'd be happy to take any questions.
I did have one question from the group, but it was more of a clarification. Could you restate how much plastic pollution is expected to increase from 2041 to 2050? I think you all cited a number.
I think we did. I think it's going to quadruple. I would have to double check our statistics. Do you know offhand, Sarah?
I'm trying to think, let me see where we had said that, but I'm with you on that stat because I was just looking at that one as well.
1 second, let's see.
And then while Sarah's confirming that, I had a quick question, although you kind of, I won't say you answered it, but you kind of provided an answer. I was curious how much your organization works with like the National Park Foundation and many of the friends groups that are inside the parks. Although it sounds like, I don't know if you have the data or whatever, but the belief is that most of the plastics coming in, not from those vendors, but from, in here in Florida, the Publix or, a Kroger or whatever there might be, wherever they are.
Yeah, so I can answer that one for sure right off. I can look for that stat again. I know we threw a lot of stats at y'all
Yeah.
this evening.
Yeah, it
but we
wasn't too
can
far back. I think it was right before we moved to like the positive notes.
Yes. So yes, we do partner with the National Park Foundation. They actually are a partner with us on this zero landfill initiative, as well as some of the friends groups, which to me, this is just such an amazing success because it really is, while this is just at 3 parks now, it's really highlighting some of the best practices that can be used at other parks going forward. So we're working with friends groups, we're working with the hospitality groups that are there that are the ones who run these businesses and all of that. So it's all part of, the mechanics of how a park works. You have to think of really every incremental person who can help with this. And certainly the work that we're doing within the boundaries of the national parks, the National Park Foundation plays a huge role with that because they are the people who can actually do some of these projects within the national park boundaries where or just been a great partnership throughout all of this work with them. And we're now looking at building out sort of the next phase of this work on zero landfill work to other parks that have more site specific issues now that we know the breadth of the issues at these particular 3 parks. Now that we're looking at how we take some of these lessons learned to places where whether it's plastic waste or food waste, just a variety of things that they're grappling with and can take some of these lessons learned and apply them there.
And then my last question that I always ask is what for the students and those that might watch this on YouTube later, what opportunities does NCPA have or NPCA have for students as far as internships or volunteering? I know you don't have a strong presence in North Florida, but a lot of students come from South Florida or maybe are interested in going other places.
I can speak to that for a moment. I'd be keen to hear if Sarah has anything to add. I would share that we do have a very active internship program here in the Suncoast. We also have a regional fellows program, and typically those opportunities are posted on our website, and we will also share them out with colleagues like all of you good folks when we have individual internship opportunities arising. Frequently, those are paid internships and they last anywhere from 3 to 6 months. And the interns get to work on a variety of different issues. Sometimes there are more biodiversity focused internships, sometimes specific ecosystem orientations like a marine orientation or an Everglades ecosystem orientation. So those are some of the opportunities. In the future, we are hoping to launch a youth leadership council in our region as well, which would be another way for students to apply to engage with us. And a lot of these opportunities, even though we are based here in South Florida, are nowadays remote. So we work with students elsewhere in Florida and even actually across the country. So we have had students join our internships from Colorado, from Wyoming, focusing on Florida-centric issues. And last but not least, I will also share that annually, a pretty consistent opportunity to engage with NPCA is through our Everglades Student Scholarship Program. And what that is a short-term scholarship where students can apply to receive funding to attend the Everglades Coalition Conference, which is typically held around January in South Florida. And it's a short conference, so the scholarship is basically supporting students to attend the conference, but it's a really great networking opportunity and chance for students to get exposure to a lot of different environmental professionals, including NPCA staff.
That's excellent. I'll have
Yeah,
to.
and I did find the stat in the question, which is directly from the letter to Secretary Holland, which I'm happy to share that as well as a follow-up. So if for anyone interested, y'all can have that too. That was where that factoid was generated from. That letter actually has a lot of amazing stats that really highlight the pervasiveness of this issue.
And I appreciate the answer about the student opportunities, and I'll have to make a note about the Everglades scholarship to promote that. I assume probably in the winter. And one of our students, as you all can probably see, said, for those internships that you talked about, would their information be located on your website?
Yes, they are typically posted on our website. Like right now, we actually have, I think it just posted last week, we have one internship opportunity available, and that is for an Everglades and engagement student intern. So that should be posted on our website. And if you don't see it there, reach out to me and I will be sure to send you the posting. But we do have that one open position in our region right now, and that is a fully remote position. There might be a couple of national park trips involved in that position. So not fully remote.
That sounds like a good opportunity. So
yeah.
Excellent. I haven't seen any other questions come through. Dr. Largo-White or Truelove, did you want to add anything before we sign off? No?
No, just to say thank you so much for being here, and thank you, James, so much for coordinating this event, as well as all of the outreach and education initiatives that we have. Thank you.
And one of the guests just thanked you for doing this, and be sure to share the video with your son. And just so you all know, this is our last NOAA sponsored program for the semester. We'll be hosting a few more talks over the next couple semesters, probably nothing over summer, and more cleanups along our coastal waterways. So thank you, Melissa and Sarah, and everyone have a great night.